Oscar Grubman is on the train reading a book by Voltaire, focusing specifically on a quote that says, "Love shows signs that cannot be mistaken." His friend Charlie brings his attention to an attractive young woman, Miranda Spear, who is heading toward him. Miranda smiles at Oscar and tries to make conversation with him, clearly showing her interest in him, while Oscar remains indifferent to her and more engrossed in his book. Oscar isn't interested in Miranda because of her hands. That's how Oscar judges women. One look at their hands can say a lot about their experience, wit, and intelligence. Miranda's hands are like a child's, which doesn't fascinate Oscar much. Charlie is concerned about Oscar because of his hand fetish and tendency to reject gorgeous girls for unnecessary reasons. Oscar, on the other hand, doesn't care much about getting laid, and is attracted by things he doesn't understand completely. Oscar values love more, something he feels for a woman he has known for a long time. But the subject of Oscar's affection doesn't know about his feelings for her, and Oscar is looking for just the right time to make his move. He plans to do it over Thanksgiving, as he's headed home to New York, so Charlie invites himself to come over for her some pie too, but Oscar clearly turns him down. The cab drops Oscar off outside an apartment complex, whose doorman Jimmy greets Oscar by the name of Tadpole. Jimmy makes a comment about how Oscar's hair doesn't look good when it's combed, so Oscar fixes it in the bathroom and uses some mouth freshener. He comes out to the sophisticated party and runs into a middle-aged but attractive woman called Diane, who is one of the guests. Oscar asks Diane if she's seen Eve around, and finds out that she went to get the keys because she wants to go to the lab tomorrow. Oscar looks down the window at a cab that has pulled up on the street when another adult, Professor Tisch, approaches him with his daughter Daphne, who is as old as Oscar, and inquires about his plans for college, even though Oscar is just a sophomore. Oscar has considered going to Columbia for pre-med, and is about to elaborate when his father Stanley grabs everyone's attention to give a traditional but politically aware toast. As he raises the glass to the return of Oscar, his prodigal son, his colleagues at the Columbia History Department, and his wife Eve, who just stepped in the apartment. The sight of her flustered face lights up Oscar's eyes immediately as he gazes at her longingly while she apologizes to everyone for being late and takes off her red scarf. Daphne catches up with Oscar later at the party, asking about his mom, who is still in France and saw Oscar last summer. Daphne rambles on about her life, while Oscar's complete attention is fixated on Eve, who is talking to the adults with grace and sophistication, until Stanley talks over her and she walks away to the kitchen with her wine glass still in hand. Oscar follows her to the kitchen, acknowledges her story, and compliments it in an intellectual manner. He takes the wine bottle and opener from her hands before he opens the bottle for her. Eve wants an update on how things are going at Oscar's school, Chauncey, and if he met any girls there. Oscar replies that he finds them quite dumb, because they haven't lived life, and Eve encourages him to give them a chance, while he keeps eyeing her soft yet aged hands. Eve walks out back to the party while Oscar keeps drooling over her, slouching, when Diane walks in and fixes his posture. She is Eve's friend and a chiropractor, who enjoys her job because there's a lot she can tell about people by their backs. Another man, Professor Sherman, steps in asking Diane for some ice cubes, while he tells Oscar secretly in French that he has a huge crush on Diane. Sherman leaves the kitchen, oblivious to the fact that Diane is just as fluent in French. She picks out Voltaire's book from Oscar's back pocket and flips through its pages as Oscar talks about Voltaire's impeccable sense of humor. Stanley calls out to Oscar and asks her to walk Daphne home, as her father is staying at the party. Oscar knows that this is an attempt to set him up with Daphne, and tries to talk his way out of it, but finds himself walking with Daphne on the streets of New York a few minutes later. Daphne invites him to a Moby concert, which he declines because he's not into that type of music. Daphne keeps talking when Oscar hails a cab and sends her home in it, making up an excuse that he has to wake up early tomorrow. He ends up in a bar drinking and smoking, as a French love song plays on the jukebox. He talks to a man and tells him that he's 40 when the tattooed woman who played the French song comes to the bar too. Oscar compliments her taste in music and French, and realizes that she isn't French, but buys her a drink anyways, as he gets to confide in her a bit. He grazes his fingers along the back of her hands and compliments how beautiful her hands are. He wanders the streets drunk that night and leans on the glass of a shop looking at the mannequin's hands when Diane walks by him. She recognizes him and takes him with her to get him some coffee, as he can barely stand, and also got his wallet stolen by the girl at the bar. As they enter Diane's apartment, she takes off her coat, and Oscar notices that she's wearing Eve's red scarf because she liked it and borrowed it from her friend. While Diane is in the kitchen fixing a cup of coffee, Oscar lies face down on the seat for Diane's patients. She tries to fix his back because he complains that his body hurts all over as he listens to her experience of being 40. Diane can't locate the pressure points on his back due to his sweater, so he gets shirtless. Diane traces her hand and applies pressure on his bare back, which gives Oscar an unknown pleasure. Eve's red scarf hanging on Diane's frame catches his eye again, and he gets off the table to drink coffee, which he accidentally spills on himself. Diane wipes it away with a towel as he gets a hold of the red scarf and starts kissing Diane, while feeling Eve's presence on her red scarf. Oscar wakes up beside Diane in her bed the next morning, and quickly slips out of bed to put on his shirt without waking her up. He grabs his shoes and walks out of the room when the voice of a man startles him as he wishes him a good morning. The man introduces himself as Phil, Diane's boyfriend, while Oscar nervously iterates that he is just a friend. Phil casually asks how long he has been seeing Diane, while Oscar defensively explains that this was the first and last time, which only happened because he's way too young and stupid. Oscar tries to recover with an excuse that he came to see Diane about a pinched nerve, when Diane joins in with a smile on her face and welcomes Phil, who just got here this morning. Oscar awkwardly heads out, and Diane offers to walk him out after winking mischievously to Phil. Oscar whispers to Diane before leaving, making her promise that she won't tell anyone about last night, especially Eve and Stanley. Oscar is about to head out when Diane throws Eve's red scarf in his face, requesting him to return the scarf to his stepmother. Oscar walks gingerly to his building with the scarf in his hand when Jimmy makes a comment about how pretty the girl was from last night. This shocks Oscar until he realizes that Jimmy is talking about Daphne, and he walks up to his home in relief. Oscar sneaks back into his father's house, hoping to avoid him, but his father directly confronts him about not coming back home last night. Oscar lies that he was with Daphne and inquires about Eve, who already left for work at dawn. She is working today because there won't be anyone else at her workplace to bug her, which Oscar views as a window of opportunity. He makes some sandwiches for a picnic, but his father wants him to accompany him for grocery shopping. Oscar reminds Stanley that he was supposed to work on his book today, and that he shouldn't disappoint the people who are looking forward to reading it, which is painfully boring in reality. Oscar gets his father hyped up about the subject of his book, going on about how young minds really dig that kind of information. All of this just in an attempt to get his father off his back. Resilient as always, Stanley doesn't give up and walks to the grocery store with Oscar, asking him about who he slept with last night. Oscar lies again that he ran into a girl from Chauncey, Miranda Spear, and she doesn't really mean much to him. This is when Stanley starts lecturing Oscar on the importance of respecting women and attending to them, just like he does with Eve. Oscar clearly believes this to be completely bogus. With a packed lunch of sandwiches in hand, Oscar stands in the park near Eve's workplace and imagines a romantic scenario with the French score in the background when he spots her listening to a busker. He visits her in the lab while she's busy at work and hands her the lunch bag. He seeks out her views on the human heart, and she places her hand on his chest to explain how small yet smart the mechanism of the human heart is. Eve believes that there is no symbolism required when it comes to the heart, because it is already so magnificent by itself. Oscar jokes that they should assign some other organ as the symbol of love, and they start coming up with silly rhymes, which makes Oscar feel very proud of himself as Eve laughs. They are interrupted by Stanley's call, who reminds Oscar about tonight's dinner, and teases him about inviting Miranda. Eve also mentions that Diane will also be there, and Oscar brings up Phil's name too, when Eve responds that Diane won't bring Phil, because she likes to keep her options open. Oscar goes to Diane's apartment to see her, but she is down at the Payard with her friends, according to Phil. Oscar runs across town to Payard and fixes his coat and hair, before going inside where Diane and her friends are having lunch. The ladies recognize him by his name, and want to hear his views about Voltaire to confirm what Diane told them. The ladies sit him down at the table, listen to his ideas, and serve him tea. Most of them leave him with their phone number, secretly praising Diane for striking gold. When it's just Oscar and Diane left on the table, he expresses his concern, as the hints Diane gave to her friends about last night might reach Phil. Diane doesn't care about Phil because they're not an item. Nevertheless, Oscar thinks it's better if Diane doesn't come to dinner tonight, because she might blabber to Eve. When Diane clarifies that she hasn't even seen Eve yet is when Oscar is shocked to reach the conclusion that Diane will eventually tell this to her childhood friend. Diane starts narrating how Eve herself had a crush on Elvis when she was 15, and any guy with sideburns would be charming to her. Diane recalls how the strangest things cheered Eve up, and how happy she once was. When Oscar digs for more information, Diane confides in him that Eve doesn't seem happy. It seems as if there's a void in her life. Hearing this puts Oscar in deep thought. He is at Charlie's house afterward, trying on fake sideburns on his face as he tells Charlie that the girl is a family friend. When he mentions the girl's best friend, he impresses and astounds Charlie with the information that he slept with her. Oscar is somewhat exhausted, while Charlie is confused, and encourages Oscar to share properly. Oscar admits that he thought that he'd really found the one with Eve, his stepmother. Charlie tries to open his eyes to logic and reality, while he also figures out that the woman Oscar slept with is Diane. Oscar admits that it was a mistake, and he got confused because she was wearing Eve's scarf and smelled like her. Charlie knows how messed up all this is, but still brainstorms for ideas to give Oscar instant sideburns. His dog stumbles into the room, which gives him some bizarre inspiration. Oscar steps out of Charlie's house with sideburns made out of dog hair with a proud stride. As he makes his shave, Stanley gets Eve's approval for inviting the Shermans to dinner too. Eve walks in on Oscar in the bathroom as he shaves his beard with just a towel wrapped around his lower body. She hesitantly walks out. Oscar answers the door and lets Diane inside the house. She plants a kiss on his cheek and compliments him, which makes Oscar nervous. She promises to be on her best behavior, under the condition that he doesn't let her drink too much tonight, after which she can't make any promises. Diane is walking arm in arm with Eve, talking about one of her dates, while Oscar walks a bit ahead of them with Stanley, trying to listen in on the ladies' conversation. Oscar also indirectly makes it known to his father that he's not that good of a listener, and doesn't pay enough attention to nonverbal cues. As Oscar sits Diane and Eve down at the table, Stanley goes to the coat room to hang their coats, where a man named Bob Spear is standing with his daughter Miranda, who goes to Chauncey. We should recall that Oscar met her on the train earlier in the movie. Stanley introduces himself to them when Oscar rushes to the spot to do some damage control. He brings Stanley back to their table, leaving Miranda's hopes high. There is some misunderstanding and confusion at Oscar's table because of the web of lies he has sown. A waiter greets them and is about to hand them a wine list when Oscar prohibits him from bringing any wine to this table. But he gives up his stance to avoid further embarrassment in front of Eve, and smiles dejectedly as the waiter pours all the adults a glass. Everyone is having a good time except Oscar, so Diane doesn't drink another glass of wine out of consideration for him, and passes him a sultry smile from across the table. Oscar gives the order in fluent French, but doesn't show much warmth to Diane. Oscar is chatting with Stanley a while later when he notices Diane drinking again and giving him a sly look. Stanley is rambling on about his work to Diane when Oscar checks in on Eve, who assures him that she's fine, and insinuates that there must be girls lining up for him at Chauncey, seeing the fine young man he has become. Oscar shares his intention of pursuing pre-medical, possibly at Columbia with Eve, hoping to meet with her frequently to go over his homework, if she agrees. While Eve doesn't mind helping him, she enlightens him on the truth that he loves literature and should be a scholar. He keeps trying to convince her that pre-med is a viable option for him, and that he'll enjoy it, when he notices Diane has gulped down yet another glass of wine. He requests Diane to pass the bread, and she rudely shoves it toward him. Eve confirms her plans with Stanley for a tennis match tomorrow, and he doesn't remember it, as usual. Meanwhile, Oscar and Diane are in a disagreement over her excessive drinking, and he whispers pleadingly to her to remove her foot from his crotch, while Eve tries to make concessions for Stanley's lack of regard and planning. Stanley finally declares that he hates playing tennis, even though Eve has the court booked, so Oscar volunteers to play tennis with her, as Diane makes a remark about how good of a sport Oscar is. Stanley appreciates Oscar's gallantry, and discloses to Eve and Diane that he has a new girlfriend whom he spent last night with, which piques Diane's interest even more. Oscar freaks out and empties out Diane's wine glass. Eve wants to know more about the girl, while Oscar tries to change the subject. All of this is even more amusing for Diane, who goes off to the ladies' room. Oscar also runs off after her, while Stanley and Eve guess that he's been acting strange because of his new girlfriend. Oscar is upset with Diane for acting so inappropriately, especially when he made it clear that his parents shouldn't know. She advises him to loosen up and grab his face to kiss him. Stanley sees this unusual and uncomfortable sight in a mirror reflection and coughs on his drink as Oscar frees himself from the grip of Diane's scarlet-painted lips. Oscar and Diane return to the table when Eve notices a piece of sideburn stuck on Diane's cheek, and Oscar quickly reaches out to remove it. Stanley anxiously prompts Oscar to share the table, and signals towards the mirror, which blows Oscar's cover. Eve is still unclear about what's happening as Oscar is clutching at straws to save himself, so Diane decides to save him the embarrassment, and comes clean to Eve about them being lovers. Oscar quits denying it, and admits that he's not dating Miranda, and he was with Diane last night. Eve finds all this very wrong, and all eyes turn to Oscar now. Back at his home, Oscar peeks in on Stanley, who helps Eve undress, but doesn't join her for bed because he's busy working. The next morning, Eve calls Diane out for putting her in a bad position, as Oscar's mother would really be bothered if she finds out about this. Diane is dismissive of her concerns, and Eve accuses her of taking advantage of a 15-year-old, when Diane reminds her that they were no saints when they were 15. Diane guesses that the real reason why Eve is so mad is because she wasn't in Diane's place, and would have done the same thing if she could. Diane accepts how sweet, smart, and passionate Oscar is, which is enough to fill a void in a woman's life. Diane provides Eve with some justification for her actions, and her reasoning somewhat resonates with Eve, even though she doesn't admit it. Eve walks in the cold park alone and catches her train, thinking about Diane's words as she leans against the metal pole. Oscar and Eve are at their tennis match now, for which Oscar has done a lot of thinking and practice as to how he would apologize to Eve for making her feel misled, and betrayed, even though what he had with Diane was meaningless. Eve absolutely butchers Oscar at the tennis match, taunting him passive-aggressively while he struggles to catch up to her score. She eventually lands such a strong blow that the tennis ball accidentally hits Oscar's forehead and knocks him down. Back at their house, she brings him an ice bag half-heartedly and leaves his room. Oscar is back at Charlie's house again to get a fresh set of eyes on this situation and seek his counsel. Charlie hints that maybe Oscar has this infatuation with Eve only because she's his stepmother, and he wouldn't be drawn to her otherwise. Then Charlie resorts to blaming Oscar's cursed genes for landing him in a situation like this, which Oscar rightfully finds useless. They hear a knock at the door as Charlie's mom checks in on the boys and is having a polite chat with Oscar, when Charlie sends her away and orders Oscar to steer clear of his mom. Oscar walks back home and runs into Jimmy. The observant doorman can sense how tense Oscar is and discovers that Oscar is in trouble with women who are much different than girls. He simply teaches Oscar that having no women would mean no trouble in his life, and Oscar thanks him for his simple yet true advice. Oscar comes home to a plate of grilled cheese and a glass of milk on the dinner table. Eve made it for him as she remembered that it is his favorite. Oscar is not so desperately trying to impress Eve anymore, and begins to talk about Diane. When Eve clarifies that she is stepping away from the matter and trusts Oscar to be responsible enough on his own. Nevertheless, Oscar musters up his courage and discloses why he felt like having sex with Diane in the first place, because of the scarf. Eve listens to his trembling voice, trying to register what she just heard. Eve goes to the kitchen to wash dishes, and Oscar stands beside her, wiping some plates. She tries to brush off a lock of hair off her forehead when Oscar reaches out and tenderly tucks a strand of her hair behind the ear. He leans in for a kiss, and Eve kisses him back, trying to fight how much she likes it. She backs off and leaves the kitchen, and Oscar hears the door, so he gets back to the dishes as his father enters the kitchen. Stanley questions Oscar if he has noticed anything off with Eve this weekend, as she's been distant for months. Stanley wonders if this has something to do with his lack of listening, which Oscar mentioned earlier. Oscar takes a lot of time to himself in order to gather his thoughts and use reason for once, since there are many loved ones involved in the mess that he has created. He leaves behind the Voltaire book on a park bench and deliberately walks away from it. Stanley and Eve drop Oscar off at the station together. Stanley goes to get Oscar's ticket, leaving him alone with Eve. They talk a bit and get some closure. While Oscar's feelings are hurt, he is not as broken as he thought he would be. Eve tells Oscar that she loves his father very much, and Oscar replies that he loves Stanley a lot too. Stanley joins them, and Eve mentions that Oscar will revisit them at Christmas, when Stanley surprises her saying they'll spend Christmas in Portugal if she wants, while Oscar will stay in France with his mother. Oscar gets his ticket and hugs Eve and Stanley goodbye. He carries his bags onto the train and spots Miranda on the same train again, trying to hoist her luggage up into the storage compartment. He helps her out, and is pleasantly surprised when she quotes Voltaire to him. Charlie, who has been standing a few feet away, sees the whole interaction and reiterates how Miranda seems to be into Oscar. Oscar doesn't fight it this time with a lame excuse, and actually accepts that Miranda smells quite nice as he settles down in his seat with Charlie. When Charlie inquires about what happened with Eve, Oscar's reply is definite, and as clear as day, "It was not as important as I thought it to be."